Morning, everybody. I'm John Dominguez. I'm a clinical psychologist with Meridian Psychiatric Partners, if you don't already know. If you've seen any of the first of the 5 of the 6 videos in the series, you may recognize the face and name. And if that's the case, thanks for rejoining. Today's topic is emotional regulation. I'll be presenting a model for that. I will try to get through this very quickly for you guys, but there is a lot of content, so I will jump right in. But a reminder of the first 5 topics in the series. Series one, the number 1 of the series, the first video was about preventive mental health care. If you haven't checked that out and you want to, it's available on this platform. The second one, I introduced a model for personal growth. And then we went into more specific skill building with a social problem solving model in the 3rd video, and interpersonal conflict resolution skills in the 4th. And then 5 was about establishing that healthy relationship with our emotions and understanding how that relationship can be tricky and prickly at times. So again, I hope you saw and enjoyed those. But if you haven't and you're interested or you want to go back to them, again, available on this platform, and would be happy to see you guys do that. But let's get into today's final video of the series on emotional regulation. What I'm going to do today is offer up another model. Sorry, more acronyms, more models, but just designed to be easy to remember. Again, I developed most of these models either to teach adolescence skills and or to teach as a training tool for my supervisees and therapists on my team to kind of guide their work with clients. So either way, hopefully it's useful for whatever purpose you might be tuning in. But let's jump in. The first I of the I decide model is identifying your emotional arousal. If we're going to have a model for how we regulate ourselves emotionally, clearly this process is most important when you're emotionally activated, right? So identifying your emotional arousal is step 1, and I'm going to delve into all 6 of these, 7 of these, excuse me, as we go, but I'll just name them right now. The second step, the D, is decreasing your emotional arousal. And then the next 3 steps, the ECI, are evaluating challenging thoughts and inserting healthy thoughts. And then the final 2 steps are about developing a plan and executing a plan. So let's jump into what the heck I'm talking about. So identifying your high emotional arousal, this seems like an easy step. It's definitely an important step. It just requires you to be aware when your emotional activation is high. And that seems easy enough, but I think we can all agree and have experienced that sometimes we can get really emotional really quickly and not really be aware of what's happening. Because this step really is about self-awareness. How can you read cues from your body, from your physiology, for example, that you're starting to get emotionally activated? Is it an increased heart rate? Is it sweating? Is it tense muscles? I tend to feel negative emotions, certainly in the pit of my stomach. Like I want to throw up or something like that. I feel nauseous. But any way that you guys can use the cues from your body that you're getting emotionally activated and be sensitive to those, the better. We just want to avoid situations, like I said, which are common, where we're getting really emotional and we don't even know that we're getting emotional. So the physiological cues, I think, are extremely important. The better you know yourself that way, the better. Cognitions, like your thoughts, this is another good clue. If you're able to recognize that what's going on between your ears, the thoughts that are vacating, that are populating that space, excuse me, are getting more extreme, intense, maybe not making a ton of sense. This is another hard thing to be aware of, because when we're highly emotional, as I've said in other films in the series, other videos in the series, some of our even most bizarre thoughts seem to make sense when we're not in a regulated spot. But that is another way. Some people are able to recognize their high emotional arousal by noticing that their thoughts don't really make a ton of sense, or they're pretty extreme. They sound kind of ridiculous. Not easy, but it's another tool if people can use it. Your behavior as well. Being able to self-monitor your thoughts and behavior. Sometimes people can notice that they're acting impulsively or maybe even aggressively, and sometimes that can cue them that, oh wait, I must be getting really revved up. I must be getting really angry. We don't want our behavior to tell us that we're getting too emotionally aroused, because oftentimes our behavior when we're emotionally aroused isn't very constructive. But sometimes we can react behaviorally to our high emotions in a more mild way, and sometimes that can cue us to, oh, you need to slow down. You need to slow down. You're getting really, really activated. So that's another thing we can use. We can use our physiology, we can use our thoughts, and we can use our behavior. But again, I'll say it again, self-monitoring and self-awareness. That's really what this step is talking about. So get to know those cues. Be very reflective when you have episodes. You're reflecting on episodes where you got really emotional. See if you can look back and look at what some of those cues were. Cues that you may have missed, but don't want to miss the next time around. Another cue you can use is room reading. I tend to rely on this a lot. Luckily, I don't. Luckily, I'm pretty self-aware when I'm getting emotional. My physiology tells me a lot. But reading the room, looking around, checking in with people. How are people responding to what I'm doing and what I'm saying? Sometimes you can look at just the faces of the people in the room, and sometimes you will get, a couple cross-eyed looks or some uncomfortable looks, and you can then know that the way you're acting or the things that you're saying are really off-putting or confusing to them or uncomfortable in some way. So if that's another thing you can make yourself aware of, and just checking into the facial expressions of the people that are around as you're experiencing your emotions. Sometimes that can give you a lot of information about, okay, do I need to slow down, or is this something everybody seems to be comfortable with? So those are some cues, some hints that you can get. And just like anything, we can practice these things. We can practice self-awareness skills and self-monitoring skills and room reading skills. So I hope that you do that and you teach your clients to do that and people that you care about to do that, because it's a really important skill if we're going to talk about maintaining emotional regulation, even in highly activated times. Because the problem with high emotion arousal, and I mentioned it certainly last video a lot, when we're highly activated emotionally, we're vulnerable to more emotion-based thinking that isn't always rational or evidence-based, doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's almost never constructive. So that's why we need to identify this emotional arousal, so then we can then work to decrease it, which is step 2. So what we're talking about here, once you've been able to identify your high emotional arousal in the ways that we just discussed, the only thing that's important, this is why step 2 comes right here and not after in any kind of problem solving process or any kind of action plan, any kind of anything. This needs to happen right after you recognize your emotional arousal. You as a human are not a good problem solver and don't have a lot of good judgment when you're highly emotionally activated. So in this step, anything that you can do to self-regulate, to just increase that arousal, just to lower the activity in that mid part of your brain so you can access your frontal cortex, for example, that does have better sort of planning and sequencing and problem solving abilities and judgment. That's what this is all about. So I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but people use mindfulness. If you're not familiar with mindfulness strategies as a emotional regulation strategy, they're effective for a lot of people. You can search Google. There are dozens of apps. There's a lot of information online about mindfulness and a lot of different types of mindfulness approaches and strategies. Some of which I can only bet could be effective for a lot of you. So I recommend that you check those out. Mindfulness strategies work insert right in here very, very well. Breathing, there are a lot of structured breathing techniques. I've gone over one that I use and I teach. There are many. You can look those up. People use movement or other kind of breaks. People use relaxation, drawing, journaling, music, taking a walk. Like, I think you get the picture, but the goal here is anything that lowers your emotional arousal, checking in with someone who cares about you, taking a 10-minute run or bike ride or something like that. Some people do a lot of things to sort of just get that emotional arousal lowered. So whatever works for you. And again, I recommend investigating these things for you, exploring, practicing, trying to build the biggest bag of tricks you can. You don't want to just have one or two that you can rely on. Obviously, it would be a lot nicer to have 7 or 8 that you can have available to you most of the time. So that's my recommendation here. Get to know yourself and what works in terms of lowering your arousal. The other piece of this is when, as we've identified our emotional arousal in the first step, one thing that could be easy to fall into is for us or others to allow others to sort of judge our emotional arousal. Why am I freaking out? What is wrong with me? We definitely want to avoid things like that. When I say identify your emotional arousal in step 1, I didn't mean judge it or be ashamed of it, even though I'll talk about it as maybe not always rational or based in evidence. That's not the that's not the point. The point isn't to judge it. The point is just to be aware of it and know what it makes you vulnerable to. And that's it. So work on not judging your emotional arousal. It is what it is. And just it's there. It's where it's at. I need to meet it where it's at, and I need to lower it without judging it. And if other people want to be judgmental of it, try not to get sucked into that cycle. There are environments that we all live in that are not emotionally validating. There are people in our lives that aren't always emotionally validating, especially if they think we're overreacting. So just be aware. It's easy to overreact to them treating you like you're overreacting, if you know what I mean. And I think that you do. So as well as you can not judge your own emotion and not be impacted by others who might be judging or shaming you from having being so emotionally activated, if that makes sense. Because once we can get our activation lowered, that's when we can access that front part of our brain, the rational thinking, the wise mind, as a lot of people call it. So that gets us to step 3. We can only start step 3, where we're starting to really process our feelings and look at the thoughts that may be underlying them. We can only do this with a wise mind. We can only do this when we're thinking rationally and when we're in a good place to problem solve and showing good judgment, social and otherwise. So here we go to step 3, the E, evaluate feelings and related thoughts. So process and manage feelings and identify any underlying thoughts. I want to take a minute here to talk about sort of this thoughts and feelings thing, because I'm trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist, but I'm also almost completed my certification in dialectical behavior therapy. And what dialectical behavioral therapists will say, they acknowledge that it's a in large part it is a cognitive behavioral strategy, and they use cognitive behavioral strategies within it, but it distinguishes itself in that where cognitive behavioral interventions really target the thoughts, the DBT therapists are really interested in processing and managing the feelings. To me, these are sort of hair splitting discussions, because we're all trying to get to the same point. Okay, whether we focus our clinical energy on validating and processing the emotions, or trying to jump in and challenge and evaluate the thoughts that underlie the feelings. Again, that could be a hair splitting kind of thing, because we're all in the game of trying to prevent any unsafe or ineffective behaviors or emotion management. We all want the same thing. So for example, I mentioned in one of my past videos that even though I'm not an angry person, I kind of get road rage. Not crazy road rage, because I do believe that I don't want to run into, somebody with like a gun rack in the back of their car and like piss them off or honk too hard at them. But I think all these angry things when people cut me off without using their blinker, I think was the example I used before, and things like that. I mean, it would be nice if I had someone in the car with me at the time to help me process and validate my feelings. Like if my son or daughter, or my wife was in the passenger seat when I'm like, oh my God, that guy just cut me off without using his blinker. What an a-hole. Like it would be nice and it would be nice in the moment if someone had said, oh, I'm so sorry. I hate when that happens. So frustrating. You're trying to drive safely and other people just don't seem to care about things like safety. That's a good validation. If I had someone in my passenger seat saying that to me, I'd feel really good. I'd want to like give them a hug or something. The problem with this, there is no problem with that. But if my goal, and I know what my goal is, my goal presumably, and again, I know what it is. I don't want to have road rage anymore. I don't want to have angry reactions while I'm driving to relatively benign things that happen all the time, like people cutting people off or not letting people in when you have your blinker on. That's another one that makes me crazy. So, I mean, I could have some passenger in my car, in the passenger seat of my car, say something that isn't emotionally validating at all and kind of attack the thought. And it might be, it'll be equally, if not more effective. If someone said, oh, don't take it personally. No one's trying to run you off the road, Dad. It's just some people just aren't good drivers. You're gonna find that anywhere. That's not an emotionally validating kind of intervention comment. But in that case with me, that would be really effective. That's a nice way of saying your thoughts about what's happening right now are irrational. That guy doesn't know you. He has no interest in driving you specifically off the road or hurting you or getting you in a car wreck. That wouldn't be smart. His insurance would go up. This isn't about you, Dad. It's about sometimes people don't use their blinker because sometimes people aren't the most responsible drivers. But guess what? That's like 30% of all drivers. So get used to it. Again, that doesn't sound very validating, but in terms of my road rage, like I don't have as many issues. I mean, I get thoughts in my head, but I regulate them very well because that's the first thing I think of now is, why am I taking this so personally? This guy doesn't even know who I am. It's just one of those things that you got to accept. Some people are just bad drivers. And then I don't have this reaction. So as much as validating the emotions are really, really nice, there are cases where if your goal is to stop the ineffective emotional expression or ineffective behaviors, sometimes you need a little more than just the validation piece, which should always start things, but it doesn't always get us everywhere we want to go. So I could say a lot more about how we manage thoughts and how we manage feelings, but in this step, for the purposes of this video, when we're evaluating, we're looking at what feelings we're dealing with, how are we labeling our emotions right now, how are we expressing them, and what, if any, underlying thoughts are there that we can look at. Okay. And when we're evaluating our feelings, we're kind of thinking about, am I expressing these emotions in a way that's effective, that's working for me? And in terms of the thoughts, it's like, do these, what thoughts are giving me this emotion? And in the case of my road rage, my underlying thought was, this person's trying to kill me. This person's trying to run me off the road. Okay, so that's what this step is all about. It's trying to isolate and look at any underlying thought that you're having in this emotional crisis. And we're looking at the feelings. What am I labeling this feeling? How am I expressing it? Okay, because the next step is challenging the thinking, or in this case, the emotional expression. So when we challenge the thinking, we're talking about, does this make sense? And in my road rage example, does it make sense that this guy targeted you, Dad, and is trying to run you off the road? Not really. Um, Everyone's experienced people. A lot of people have turned into another lane without using their blinker. A lot of people have experienced other people doing that. I really don't think this is about you, Dominguez, and you alone. So the evidence doesn't really support that this person is targeting you and trying to run you off the road. When we're looking at the emotional expression or other thoughts we may be having, cognitive behavioral therapists are a little more aggressive. I can be really aggressive in attacking these thoughts because I do firmly believe that when if they're born in a very emotional place that they probably have holes in it in terms of how rational they are, and I want to attack that. And that's that's a cognitive behavioral intervention, and it can be helpful. Other therapists like DBT therapists would kind of cool down on the real aggressive attacking of the thought and just kind of ask like other challenging questions that maybe aren't as aggressive, like is this thought helpful, is it an effect, is this helping you get through this moment and process this experience that you're having in a safe and healthy way, is it working for you basically, or do we need to think about another way? Again, I think both can be really effective. There's a million different examples of, and there's client variables involved here. I think the bottom line is know yourself, know your client, that kind of stuff. But I wanted to put it all out there in terms of what we're challenging when we're talking about emotions and with behaviors. So another way to do a good job in this step is to explore, counter evidence. I'm locked into this thinking, whether it's right or wrong, but let's see, are there any pieces of information that we have in the situation that disconfirms my conclusion? I don't want to jump to conclusions, right? Nobody does. Everybody wants to have good judgment. So when we're regulated, which we are by step 4 hopefully, then we are able to look at counter evidence. This person that just cut you off, he's been driving behind you for the last 15 minutes. Did he make any other attempts to drive you off the road? No. I think he just got lazy. So you know what I mean by exploring counter evidence. Another way to go at this is just playing devil's advocate with yourself and forcing yourself to come up with alternative interpretations of what's happening, even if it doesn't feel like like that's plausible. Even if you're really locked into your own way of thinking about that. Number one, I want you to unlock it. Let's thaw that a little bit so that you can be flexible in your thinking, and then come up with 2 or 3 other interpretations about what's going on. Maybe the guy's in a hurry. Maybe the guy had a really bad, driving instructor who didn't stress using the blinker. Maybe the blinker doesn't work. Who knows? But just that kind of thinking will keep us from getting locked into the original thoughts that we were having that may or may not have been irrational. They probably weren't, and they definitely weren't effective. Okay, they weren't effective because it was getting us to a highly activated place. That's why we started this process in the first place. So once we evaluated the thinking and challenged the thinking and the emotions, the next step is to use that information to introduce, increase. I like insert here. I say insert more than any, but they're all I's, so they all work in the second I of the model. Insert healthier thinking. So more evidence-based thoughts, more accurate thoughts, more healthy, constructive thoughts. And in terms of emotions, ways to manage and express emotions that again are effective and aren't going to add to the problem or aren't going to increase your dysregulation, because that's what this whole thing is about, is staying regulated. So presumably, or according to the model, and this is how the process does work when it works, is once you've been able to look at the thinking and challenge it, and you do this in wise mind, when you're regulated, now you have different types of thinking to be inserted. This is what my son helped me do in my example of my healthier thinking is the guy who cut me off has no interest in me at all. He's just a bad driver, and they're just bad drivers, and you just need to accept that. Okay. And I can move on from that. Okay. I'm not going to hang on to a lot of emotional activation because 3 out of every 10 drivers don't use their blinker on the highway. That's just something that it's not going to be hard for me to radically accept. Okay. So that's the last step of the ECI, the 3 steps inside this, which is really kind of a cognitive restructuring. I talked a lot about emotions in here too, because I think we need to, but that's if you took those 3 steps, the ECI, the evaluate, challenge, and insert steps of this model, that's really kind of a cognitive restructuring with a lot of attention to emotion management as well. Because again, I think that's definitely think that's key. And cognitive behavioral therapists, if I can just plug them, have always thought that that's key, but it's just been, what our primary intervention is when we want to attack that thinking. So once we've been able to insert healthier thinking, presumably we're at a point where we're not dysregulated anymore and we can develop a plan. Okay. And in one of the videos, we talked about some plans, whether it's social problem solving or any kind of plan. Sometimes your plan is to do nothing. And like in the case of the road rage, the guy with the blinker. This is an example I used in another video of your best action is to do nothing. You don't need to, track the guy down and have a conversation with him or threaten him. Just let it go. Do nothing. Okay. Get over it. But that's the first thing that I want to say about developing a plan. We're really, to me, it might be more complicated than this, but like I said, I try to simplify things or not overcomplicate things. When we talk about plans, we're talking about an action plan versus a coping plan. And the difference is, and so this is one of the first things I want you guys to think about, is this a problem that has a solution? And if it is, can I activate the solution? Can I contribute to the process of facilitating the solution? And if those are true, then yes, your plan is going to be about, attempting to solve the problem if it's something that you can solve. If you got emotionally dysregulated in the first place because you got in a fight with a loved one and you said some really awful things to each other, an action plan that you could come up with is a problem-solving plan. You might want to use some of the skills that we taught in the other videos, like around relationship repair or using the feedback model to try to address the conflict in a way that hopefully won't intensify the problem or what's going on. So that's an example of an action plan versus a coping plan. A coping plan is something that you can't really do anything with. I had a couple friends this year, have to put down their dogs. They're the dogs that they've had, for years, and they were just devastated because they had the dogs were in the family for a dozen years kind of thing. And that's one of those things that there was no action plan. There was really nothing that they could do to solve that problem that was causing them so much emotional arousal, just sadness and grief and loss. So that is an example of, this is just about a coping plan. How do I deal with that loss? How do I deal with the loss of the family member, the dog? And this is when we're talking about, if you look at the next bullet point, this is where we're talking about problem solving versus distress tolerance and coping. So 2 different types of plans. One, you're kind of more active, and the other, you're like, I just need to deal. How do I just deal with stuff that's not in my control? Okay. The action plans are in your control, presumably. The coping plans are not. So the focuses are the foci, if you will, are going to be different. So when you execute the plan, it all comes back to this. And this is probably why I put this last in the series, is because executing the plan of the I Decide model is really using a lot of the strategies that we addressed in the first 5 videos. Because whether you're doing an action plan like relationship repair or social problem solving, you have those models to help guide you through that process using those skills. Or we have more of a distress tolerance situation because you need to you need to learn how to cope with something that you can't control. And I talked a little bit about distress tolerance in this video today when we talked about how we regulate ourselves. But another, there are other ways to tolerate distress, not just in the moment when we talked about mindfulness and breathing and relaxation, but over time, if you're having trouble coping with something, like having to put down a long time dog, those intrusive thoughts of sadness and missing the dog are going to keep recurring, for a while. And so other distress tolerance skills could be about redirecting yourself, reframing, you know, thinking about more happy memories, planning ways to honor and remember the dog in a positive way, that doesn't pull your affect down. So when we talk about executing the plan, or as I put on this slide, executive the plan, sorry for that typo, that's what we're talking about. And knowing that your focus is controlling on what you can control, versus what you can't. And even those problems that you can't solve, how you manage and cope with them is largely in your control. And helping other people, use these models in these ways, is also kind of what I'm advocating here. So that's the I Decide model, and that ends the 6-part series on general psychological wellness. I hope you found it somewhat useful, and we will be, if there's interest, there will be other series of training videos and things that Meridian will be doing. So give us any feedback, and hopefully you guys can stay connected to our group in that way. But thanks again for attending and being part of this, and I hope everybody stays well.